Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to this new episode of my podcast, Digital Tomorrow. I'm going to be talking today to Christine Law from Hong Kong. She's actually, well, as you know, a very important person, but I leave it to Christine to introduce herself and to tell you a bit more about her personal journey.
Thank you.
And well, if you can, Christine, please let my listeners know a bit more about your personal journey, what you've done before, what you're doing now, because I know you have a fascinating career. So I think it might be interesting for my listeners to get to know a bit more about you in case they don't.
Yes, well, maybe I should start to say a little bit about who I am. So I was born in Hong Kong. I was born in 1956, so I'm in my 60s. And I was born at a time when Hong Kong was a British colony, very much part of, you could say, a colonial system where it was really important to learn to speak English, as you can imagine, in the 50s, in the late 50s. And when you go into the 60s, so when I was a small child, it was the Cultural Revolution in China. And for our parents, this was a very troublesome period, obviously, thinking that China was shutting her door again and that it was really important for their children, i.e. people of my generation, to be educated and to be educated in English, because that will be the world that we would navigate. So I would say that I'm quite a typical Hong Kong person who was educated, you could say, by the British in British schools and then eventually going to school in the UK. However, I came back to Hong Kong in the very late 70s, in 1979, because you will remember that was the time when China declared her open door policy. And I thought at the time I was going to be a lawyer in the UK. I thought it would be a very good idea if I could catch up on Chinese law, because if China was going to really open up again, obviously business, commerce, everything was going to require law. And I should learn something about the principles of Chinese law. And to do that, I would need to brush up my Chinese. So I came back to Hong Kong in 1979, before I started working for a British law firm, to brush up on my Chinese. And what happened was I never went back to the UK, because during the time when I was about to finish my Chinese language course, I ran into a family friend who worked for an American company, and they had just received a license, a permit, to open a representative office in Beijing in 1980. But no one was interested to go to China. It was seen as a hardship post. And many people in Hong Kong, they really couldn't find anyone who spoke Mandarin and who wanted to go, you know. So anyway, I put my hand up and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And they said, we'd love to have you, you know. And so I started my career in 1980 on the 2nd of January in Beijing. So that's really the first part of my career, you could say. So I feel very much that I was there at the beginning when China opened her door. And I felt that that actually changed my life, because I was able to really see what China was like in 1980. And my work for this company, which was in commodities, lasted 12 years. So I actually ended up traveling to China very often from Hong Kong. Instead of becoming a lawyer, I became a commodities trader. So I'm very interested in natural resources and commodities. And after that 12 years, essentially I started working for another company for a very short time, but then I embarked on a political career. I was invited to be appointed onto the Hong Kong legislature. So this was at the tail end of British rule in Hong Kong. Because I was part of an NGO that talked about public affairs, This was kind of like my nightlife as opposed to my working life as a commodities trader. The British colonial government asked if I would, or invited me to join the legislature as an appointed legislator. So this was in 1992 when Chris Patten first came to Hong Kong. So for the last 5 years of British rule, I kind of have a good seat, like in a boxing ring. I had a good seat to kind of observe and be part of the political process. So anyway, after that, I continued to run for elections, to be a member of the Hong Kong legislature. But to cut a very long story short, after about 9 years, I decided I wanted not to be in frontline politics, but to focus on public policy. It may be because Hong Kong's relatively immature political process. We didn't really have what you would call professional politicians. We were all so new at the job. And most of us hadn't really thought about public policy because, of course, once you're in the legislature, there are so many practical day-to-day issues to deal with. And I remember having to think about, should Hong Kong have a pension scheme? Well, why do we need one? What should it be for Hong Kong? And these were not issues that people in Hong Kong at the time in the 1990s that they had really thought about. So, I was very much part of the evolutionary process in the late colonial period, transiting into the early period of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region under Chinese rule to develop what I would say a political career, political life. So I decided not to continue to run in elections. I decided I would form a public policy think tank, which I did, called Civic Exchange. I ran it for about 12 years, and then I was invited to join the government as the Undersecretary for the Environment. So I very much worked on the policy side of the environment. And that ended in 2017 when there was another change of government. So since then, I've been attached to university. Today, I'm with the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So I continue to work on public policy issues, but from outside the government. And what I'm trying to do today is to link the scholarship at university with public policy, good ideas or good technology from universities that should be introduced to either business or to government to help solve specific problems, especially those that are related to climate change and to sustainability. So that's where I'm spending the bulk of my time. But of course, I continue to be extremely interested in Chinese politics. And of course, right now we're going through a geopolitical shift in the world that I think is the most important one going forward. Again, I feel I have a little bit of a background to think about these things. So I write, I talk, I teach, and I feel very privileged to be able to do it from Hong Kong.
Well, thank you very much, Christine, for sharing your personal journey. I think it's a fascinating career, everything that you mentioned now, like being there when China opened up and everything you did after that in politics as well. So I wanted to ask you about your role as Undersecretary for the Environment at the Hong Kong government. You mentioned that you were appointed for that role. You're no longer doing that, but still, when you were doing that, what were your main tasks there?
Well, I think in terms of political life, I went to my job actually being quite clear of why I'm there and how I should do my job. And I'm glad I was able to do that. It's because I did spend a long time as a politician, as a legislator. So I understood the political structure, I understood the process, and I also knew many of the political figures in the legislature and on the executive side of government. Secondly is I was the Undersecretary. I was not the Secretary. My job is to serve the Secretary, to support him in what he wanted me to do. And we had an arrangement of how to split up the task that had to be done. So I was, in many ways, the policy wonk. There were areas where I was very familiar with, and at that time, air pollution was a very big issue. Climate change became more and more important, nature conservation. So there were a number of policy issues that I had already spent a long time on. And so those were the areas where I took the policy lead. And my goal was very clear. My goal was that I was there to help with forming new policies. I had an arrangement and understanding with the chief executive who appointed me that that he would allow us to do things. And so one of my, you could say, one of the things I started off with, based on research that we did at the think tank, was to reduce air pollution. And we suggested that Hong Kong needed to control the emissions coming from large container vessels because they were actually very harmful to public health. The research that we did in Hong Kong, the idea of how we would control it, I had the privilege to take those ideas up to Beijing to discuss with the then vice minister. And we were able to actually stimulate a change of thinking in the national government on that level, whilst we were suggesting that in Hong Kong and in southern China, in the Pearl River Delta, that we could make certain changes. But obviously, when the national government took notice and thought this was a good idea, they actually took it nationwide. So I think it demonstrated that wherever you have a new idea, even in a small part of the country, that it is possible in a large country like China to adopt it, to refine it, and to take it nationwide. So I think if we look at it from the perspective of whether Hong Kong could help to shape mainland policy, the answer is definitely yes.
Mm-hmm. And well, I mean, that's very interesting. And you mentioned as well that you were the founder and CEO of a think tank or a non-profit public policy think tank called Civic Exchange, whose main areas, as far as I know, are to do research on air quality, environment, nature conservation, design and planning. I focus on Hong Kong, I guess. Well, I did my PhD, my doctoral thesis, on town planning in Hong Kong, so I needed to deal with those topics a bit. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about Civic Exchange. Like, I mean, first of all, if I'm right when it comes to the areas that you were doing research on, and then what did you do there? Like, what were the main goals of this think tank?
Well, we saw ourselves as a think and do tank. And what we mean by think and do is you do the research and you also work out how it could be implemented. So there's a practical side to the research. And actually, during my time there as the CEO, we did more than the environment. I know that Civic Exchange, of course, still exists, and it's run by my successors. They have focused very much on environment and sustainability. But during my time there, we also did equal opportunity. We did constitutional reform, because during the first part of the time that I was there, one of the declared interests of Hong Kong was how to move towards greater electoral politics. So we spent the first 7 years also publishing and doing research greatly on how Hong Kong might do that. So actually, from a think tank point of view, our brief and research area was quite wide. But because then I went on to become the Undersecretary of the Environment, people had kind of formed the impression that Civic Exchange mostly did environmental work, which wasn't quite true in the earlier days. But in terms of the kind of research, we also had a principle that what's really important is not to start off with what your opinions are. The research ought to figure out what the facts are, you know, how a particular situation got to a particular stage, because it's from there that you need to think about how to change it. We also took into account the political process in Hong Kong. So it isn't like, well, ideally we could go from A to B, because very seldom are things so ideal that you can go from A to B. So we did the research looking at the history, how it got there. We tried to establish the facts so that whichever side of the political divide you're on, let's agree on the facts. And then we can discuss how many options there are and what these options are based on. Are they based on certain ideology about, socialism, capitalism, or whatever ism? Or are we looking at something else? Are we looking at the practical side? Is it a legal problem? Or how do we fit all of the above into a new narrative of what Hong Kong could adopt? So those were the kind of research attitude that we had.
I see that's very interesting, and I like this approach that you mentioned about doing practical things, not just doing research. And kind of related to that, I wanted to ask you about an area that's been there for years, especially in Hong Kong, but I feel like it's becoming much more important lately, and that area is green finance. I wanted to ask you, like, first of all, if you could please share with my listeners what green finance is, and then as well, whether you would say that Hong Kong is becoming a green finance hub or not, and why.
Yeah, well, red finance, green finance, blue finance, whatever you want to call it, it's finance, right? It's moving money. How do we move money towards more environmentally sustainable projects? So green finance, that's what it's really about. And the idea that we need to move money there, we need to think about how to do it, and we may need public policy to do so. It's because we cannot use the existing market mechanism to ensure that enough finance goes into decarbonization or biodiversity, the kind of green projects that people say we need to do a lot of. I think within green finance, there is what I call the 101 of green finance, which is, can we establish that certain types of projects are considered green? So we're talking about standards and so on, what kind of projects are considered green. Then secondly is, of course, we run into the practical side of, well, if you put money there, what kind of return do you get? And I think to be really a green finance hub, there has to be accompanied with the moving of the money, some kind of intellectual debate also about moving money, about rate of return, about value, and how to express them in financial terms. Because we are demanding of ourselves to go on a green revolution, because decarbonization is about changing the way energy is being created and being used in the whole world. And bearing in mind, for example, that more than 80% of the world's energy is still by fossil fuels. So if you want to dramatically reduce the use of fossil fuels, you've got to ensure you invest very, very majorly into non-fossil fuels energy. So in order for you to do that, if you just wait for it to happen under current market conditions, well, it's not happening. So we need government policy to favor certain types of investments. And we need, as an intellectual center, to also have those debates that will help the world, not just in Hong Kong, but to help the world to think through under what kind of projects would you live with, what kind of rate of return. We can't have very high rate of return for everything that we do, but if we don't sit down and discuss it so that people who have money can see how they can invest in different ways, I don't think we're going to go very far. Now, right now, of course, government are raising green bonds. Governments are the ones who are changing the foundation of requirements. So, for example, all the governments, including the ones in Hong Kong, requiring banks, for example, to disclose their climate risk, or for listed companies to start disclosure on their environmental, social, and governance performance. These are early things that regulations is pushing towards that forces business to think about their environmental footprint. And hopefully there'll be more going in the direction of money being invested in greener projects.
I see. And when it comes to Hong Kong specifically, would you say that Hong Kong is a green finance hub? Would you say that it's going in the right direction right now?
Well, there's something that Hong Kong has done that I think is that many others have not done yet. So, for example, all our listed companies have to now report on ESG. It's a mandate, they have to do it. And banks have to, and all the banks in Hong Kong, the local banks, they're all listed, and then the foreign banks that are here, in a way, they all need to report on their ESG to the banking regulator. So these are things that are pushing the rest of companies to start, or they're being asked, right? They're being asked up and down the supply chain for information. So it's created a great flurry of activities of at least, oh, I got to report. How do I report? Who can help me with it? And when do I have to do it by? So these are now very live discussions in Hong Kong. And we do have set dates for when it has to happen. Many other places, companies are still doing it on a voluntary basis, where in Hong Kong, it's now a requirement to do it. So I think that's good for Hong Kong. Secondly is, this is a new activity. We don't wake up in the morning knowing how to do this. And even in the EU, where thinking has gone much further, I don't think all European companies are saying, oh yeah, we know exactly how to do it. We're still struggling through, and we're struggling through together because this is becoming a global issue. The Europeans are also requiring future imports into Europe to disclose the information, and something called CBAM, which you're probably aware of in Europe, is going to start seriously in 2026 with a number of major commodities. So, the world is kind of changing in this regard, and it's having an impact on global supply chain. And this is where Hong Kong has to make sure that its companies can follow what is happening around the world. So I think Hong Kong is actually in the kind of the front of the pack rather than at the back. Although in Hong Kong, we always like to blame, we always like to kind of complain to ourselves that we're not good enough. I actually think, okay, actually you're in the right place right now. You just need to work really hard in the next few years.
And well, I mean, you talked before about decarbonizing, carbon neutrality. So, I mean, as you know very well, mainland China plans by 2060, if I'm not mistaken, to have like a fully established, a clean, low carbon, safe and efficient energy system. So I wanted to ask you whether you think that's feasible, and how you think that China will reach this goal, in case you think they will.
I think that's a really good question. And we need to pay a lot more attention to what China is doing and how China is doing it. Actually, one of my areas of research is to follow and to track the Chinese decarbonization process. China is very practical in the sense that it sets targets and timelines to what it thinks it can do. So the first timeline it has to deliver before 2030 is that it would achieve carbon peak. And after achieving carbon peak, it will then dramatically have to reduce carbon, the use of carbon, or the use of fossil fuels, so that carbon would be reduced towards 2060. As I said, the Chinese are very practical, but in their practicalness, they're actually very radical. So what they're doing is, politically, you can't have no energy. So you need to ensure energy is still reliable. And you need a lot of energy in China because China is a major manufacturing and exporting economy. And you have 1.4 billion people. So, you can't have no energy on a cold winter's day or a hot summer's day. So politically, they are using coal. They're using coal to pivot. So therefore, they're using what they have domestically. They're using coal, and they're building out non-fossil fuels energy, which is renewable energy and nuclear, plus things like hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, these newer energy. So in order for them to build out the non-fossil fuels, they need fossil fuels to be the base. But their plan is that once you reach a peak, then fossil fuels becomes backup power. So, it's kind of going up and then dramatically pushing it down over a relatively short time. So what you're seeing in China today, if you take coal, for example, because China has coal, it is importing a lot of the natural gas, but coal is the foundation of China's energy security. So that's why it's confusing for people looking at China to say, very good that you're building out renewable energy at such scale and speed, but why are you also still building out coal? The reason they are building out coal is because they will close down all the old fleet. Mm-hmm. So when they close down the fleet, the coal fleet that remains in China will be the cleanest coal fleet in the world. And over time, coal will become the backup power. So to be able to get this done within a relatively short time requires sustained and committed policy. It requires the state to be able to invest in non-fossil fuels energy. It requires them from the perspective of good engineering to learn how to, in a way, take the feed of so many different types of energy and turn it into electricity, and to get the state-owned enterprises and the private companies, especially the high-emitting industry, to actually decarbonize. So you see many, many balls in the air. Each one of them are at unimaginably large scale. And, it is therefore possible to follow what China is doing from year to year. And the story is completely fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, thank you very much for summarizing this, Christine. And before wrapping this up, I wanted to ask you one final question, because as far as I know, you also teach in LA, in Los Angeles. So you have this US perspective as well, aside from the one from China. So I wanted to ask you, like, from your standpoint, regarding sustainability, climate change, carbon neutrality, what do you think the US is doing better than mainland China or Hong Kong, and vice versa? What do you think that mainland China and Hong Kong are doing better than the US?
Well, I taught in the US at the business school of UCLA from 2018 to 2022. And I taught a course on risk. Now, talking to my students, I think one of the issues that maybe Americans and actually even Hong Kong students or people in Hong Kong, they don't think about the concept of development, because maybe we take it for granted that we're already developed. So I think if you come from China or the global South, the notion of development is very important. And so people think about, as we continue to develop, how do we develop sustainably? So I think when we're in the US or even in Hong Kong, people don't think in developmental terms, right? And I think it's important for rich economies like the US to maybe reframe how they look at the advancement of their society in development terms. And I think what I find surprising about the US is it is a very, very wealthy country. in terms of natural resources, human talent, and so on. But it probably does not ask itself enough about how to develop for the benefit of the people as a whole. Whereas, if you're in China, the constant political rhetoric is, what more can we do for the people? Now, I know sometimes people say, isn't this all just political rhetoric? Now, the political rhetoric is being repeated all the time. So, people do hear, okay, what are you doing for me, in terms of ordinary people? So I think in the US, they talk in terms of concepts like the maintenance of our democracy and a form of liberal democracies, but they don't translate it into something more practical. Like, what would you do for the people? So how would you improve, for example, transportation? And you can't talk about public transportation in the US because it is such a car culture. So what I'm saying is, if you wanted to talk about public transportation, which China has done it very well, and Hong Kong is very good in public transportation. So you could say these are areas where Hong Kong and China are just so far ahead of the US. But in the US, they don't look at it that way. They look at, can we afford to buy a car, and how much is gasoline costing us? And yes, if we can do this in a more low carbon way, that would be very good, right? So there's a difference in how they think, how they frame policies on transportation, and the imagination of the public, how the public can benefit from transportation. So of course, China and the US, you can see these are very large countries. Hong Kong is a city. So we're looking at the density of public transport in a city, which I think Hong Kong is the best in the world. So if you were to contrast New York with Hong Kong, well, we have a much newer, better, cheaper system. If you're to look at Los Angeles, then they have no public transport system worth talking about. But if you're looking at China, you can see first tier, second tier, third tier cities, they all have underground systems. What I'm saying is, so the imagination of what is needed for the people are entirely different. So that's why sometimes I think it's not so easy to do a straight contrast. But for sure, US and China, they're both incredibly well talented places. And that's why it's so sad for me that US-China conflict is preventing the two countries from establishing the kind of partnership that they clearly have. So, I mean, for example, just take solar panels. China makes the cheapest, best quality solar panels available in the world. The US needs a lot of it to be able to implement their renewable policies. So it's a perfect partnership, but the US is unhappy with China, and therefore they're not, in a way, allowing the smooth export or trade of solar panels to the United States. So let's see going forward whether these things can be resolved.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. And well, it's time now to wrap up this episode. Christine, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm sure that all my listeners will have learned a lot about not just your personal journey so far, but green finance in Hong Kong, decarbonization, or even these very interesting final remarks about the US, mainland China, public transportation. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and I got to learn a lot from you for sure.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
No, the pleasure was absolutely mine. And well, to all my listeners, thank you very much for listening to this episode. And please stay tuned for the next ones. Thank you and see you all soon.